Hello, BookTube, and welcome to the very first installment of 2 If by Sea, which is a year-long reading project that I'm doing with Mark at Richardson Reads. I'll leave a link to his channel down below, in which we explore nautical literature. Just the tiniest, sliverest, smallest tip of the iceberg, but still. And we decided that the way to do it would be to swap off fiction and nonfiction per month. So in the month of January, he's doing nonfiction, and I'm doing fiction. And when it comes to nautical fiction, well, you already know, there's just an endless ocean of possibilities. Nautical fiction is just, it just booms. It had an enormous heyday under Francis Marryat, and then it went away for a bit, and then it blossomed again under C.S. Forster and has never stopped. There will never be a time when there aren't ongoing series of nautical fiction, and also it shows up everywhere, even in books that aren't series. And so you'd think with all those titans for me to pick from, that I would start with one of them. But for my first installment for fiction, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to pick a contemporary novel, because there's plenty of time to get to fiction, and a lot of the fiction doesn't need my help. Whereas this book is, it's by Gary Maynard, and it's Plumbelly. We might have seen this. I might have got it in the mail on this channel at one point in the past. But this is a 2018 novel from a press that I think is called Flat Hammock Press, so pretty much self-published. I doubt you're going to see this in your bookstore anywhere other than perhaps Martha's Vineyard, which is where I reviewed it. I reviewed it for the Vineyard Gazette, and it was one of those. It was one of those books where, of course, I didn't know about it. I had never heard of it. It was in any kind of really, in any kind of healthy working reviewing relationship, the books will be your choices, but also your editor's choices. I've been in all three possible situations. I've been in situations where the editor is too busy and all the choices are mine, in which case I do all the work that I really like, but I don't have the pleasure of discovery. And then there's the absolute opposite end of that spectrum, where the editor is maybe a bit of a martinet and wants to control everything. And, tells you which books it's going to be and says my way or the highway. And then in the middle, if you're lucky, you get a good editor like the one I have, who's perfectly happy to suggest books, perfectly happy to take suggestions, where there's no egotistical skin in the game, which is great, because it's takes all sets of eyes to cover the horizon of literature. And so I didn't know anything about this book, and my editor suggested it to me, sent it to me. I read it, and I thought it was terrific. Absolutely terrific. In fact, so good that it became one of those kinds of books that I read from small presses, subsidy presses, self-published presses, where I want to cry it from the rooftops, because I know nobody's ever going to hear about it. I was very happy to get a chance to review it, but even there, the readership for the Martha's Vineyard Gazette, much as I hate to say it, is not as extensive as it would be for the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal. So I thought I would use this as my first example, especially since I can guarantee that you will enjoy it. It's a story of three disaffected teenagers, Gabe, his friend Lloyd, and Tanya, who are, for one reason or another, find themselves in Tongu Harbor down in the South Seas, and for various reasons of their own, none of them free from trauma, decide on the spur of the moment to take off in a unprepossessing but extremely seaworthy sloop named Plumbelly, which had belonged to some young guy who was sailing around the world and who was dumb enough to kill himself in a gas fire that almost set his ship on fire. But Plumbelly survived, was scuffed, but was not fundamentally damaged. And Gabe and Lloyd realized this, and with a little tender love and care, she's seaworthy again. And they take her out. They leave Tongu Harbor. They leave their life behind, knowing that a lot of people are going to be looking for them. And they just embark on an open ocean adventure. And in short order, Gabe and Tanya are lovers. Lloyd is kind of the wisecracking extra guy, although there's an added depth of tragedy to him that it's not ever very far from the surface. You have to look to see it, but it's personal details like that, the sort of scuffed, scarred souls of these young people that was the biggest surprise to me in the book. Gary Maynard knows his ways around ships. He knows his ways around the ocean. So I was expecting the nautical parts of this nautical novel to be really good. They are really, really good. This is an author, much like Patrick O'Brian, who never stops to explain any terminology or concepts of sailing, and yet they don't get in the way, and they never slow you down. You never get to a point and wonder what is that, and have it hurt your reading experience. That's a rare talent. There are plenty of nautical fiction writers who never really mastered that talent, and they either know it and load their books with exposition, or they don't know it and lose their readers. But Plumbelly doesn't do either one of those. This book is full of the nautical experience of taking a sloop to sea, but not so as you've noticed, so to speak. You could be what Lucky Jack Aubrey would call a grass-combing swab. You'll still love this book. And there's the personal elements that were the surprise to me, although there's plenty in store here. The author avoids another endemic problem of nautical fiction, which is to think once you do the nautical, you're done. That's not true. It's absolutely not true. You have to do the same old heavy lifting and toting and bailing that any other novelist has to do. And he remembers that. So we have a catastrophic storm at sea. We have a shipwreck. We have a gun that is loaded. And when there's a gun that's loaded, as you know, the old fiction adage is you can't ignore that. Sooner or later, it's going to go off. And also strangers that are met along the way, and ultimately some sort of resolution to the traumas that put our trio to sea in the first place. All of it's done really, really well. Even the author's narrative decisions that I initially raised an eyebrow at, like, for instance, mentioning Plumbelly at the beginning and then giving us a long grounding section on his characters before anything happens, turned out to be wise. I even after I was done with the book and went back and looked at that and turned it all around, I thought, no, he was right. Any way you did that other than the way he did it wouldn't have worked as well. And despite that plot, or in addition to that plot, there's also tremendous lyricism throughout this book that just crops up at the weirdest moments. Like, for instance, there's one point where our trio notices a nearby reef. Those of you who've done any sailing will know that's not a good word. It's a very bad word. And they say, our noon position showed us not more than 10 miles east of the reef, give or take 10 miles. God finds us amusing, I said. That's Gabe talking. Oh, now you think he's watching over us, Lloyd said. It's a divine joke, I said. We sail hundreds of miles in one direction, change course at random, and end up with the only reef in 10,000 square miles right under our lee. At least it's not under our keel, Tanya said. We can be thankful for that. I'm not thanking anybody until I can go ashore somewhere and buy a burger, Lloyd said. We all stared at the horizon to leeward, watching for the telltale spume of spray, the white, broken water that would give away the lurking, keel-ripping teeth of the earth. And that's in classic nautical fiction tradition. That is also a bit of foreshadowing, because you know that Plumbelly is also a character in this book, and it also has to have its own traumas. But there's a wonderful moment. I think I quoted it in my review. If my review is free of a paywall of any kind, I will leave a link to it down below. But there's a wonderful moment. It's actually another signature of a lot of nautical fiction where you're out and about on the ocean and you encounter a whale. It's not just Moby Dick. Quite a few pieces of nautical fiction have that moment. I don't begrudge it to them. There are also quite a few nautical movies that have that moment, right? Castaway with Tom Hanks. There's something about it. And those of you who have been to sea, and maybe I myself have spent an enormous amount of time at sea, and an enormous amount of that time, probably 80% of that time, was spent in wind-driven vessels, wooden-hulled, wind-driven vessels. And in a vessel like that, on a nice, relatively low-work afternoon, if a whale comes visiting, that's a thing. That's an amazing pausing moment. And it happens to our trio. A whale comes to visit Plumbelly, and they just watch. It's calm weather. They just watch. The whale seemed to ignore him. Lloyd's calling out, wondering if he knows of any good mozzarella that's available in Fiji. And the whale seemed to ignore him for a moment. Then, ever so slowly, he rolled on his side, showing us his vast white belly, and he looked up at us with one watery eye, wise and curious and peaceful and immensely sad. "If God has an eye," I said, "that's what it looks like." We sat in silence, and the whale continued to swim alongside in his patient and tireless way. Tanya and I held hands, and I put my arm around Lloyd's shoulder, and we sat for a little while, and the sun sank lower. The light bounced and scattered off the backs of the waves ahead like a moving sea of mirrors. Plumbelly decided to play a game of her own, and she wandered to port and gave the whale a nudge with the side of her bow. He drew away immediately, not ready for so bold a courtship and not impressed with the feel of Plumbelly's wooden flesh. He took up station 100 yards to port and swam in company with us toward the reefs of Fiji. As the afternoon light faded and the sea darkened with the coming of night, all we could see was the vaporous plume of his spout as he breathed, and soon there was only the sound of his blowing to let us know that he was still with us. And very shortly after those contemplative moments, the action of the book, dark and deadly, convulses things, and the real adventure starts, and you won't stop reading. I think you won't stop reading. I was on tenterhooks the whole time that I was reading this and thinking about it critically, wondering, you always wonder, to what extent your own bias might be influencing your reading. Right? If I got a murder mystery tomorrow set in 1520 starring Erasmus, the Dutch humanist, it could be bad, and I might not see it in my first read along. I would hope that after time I would, but my enthusiasm would be such that I might miss it the first time around. And I have done so much sailing in crafts very similar to Plumbelly that I was initially worried when I was reading this that perhaps that was influencing my reading. But I am convinced after a second and far more, screwed down nuts and bolts reading, that I'm not, that this is just a fantastic novel. And one that I would be willing to bet you have missed. No fault of the author. It could be any number of reasons why you would avoid the rigmarole of the top 5 publishers. It's an absurd rigmarole. It could be any number of reasons why you would avoid that. I'd be willing to bet that I would avoid it in such a situation. And of course, the last 6 or 7, 10 years have shown us one thing clearly in the book world, which is that there's no stigma attached anymore to small or self-publishing. No, there's no stigma attached to it at all anymore. Those books get reviewed regularly now. Not as regularly as I would like to see. Evidence this would have to have a special pitch to get to the notice of a really big journal, but still, the great work is there. And that's in the end all that we should care about. So for my installment of 2 If by Sea, this time around, I'm doing fiction. I want to recommend this book. I have no idea what size print run the author had. I have no idea how many copies are available. But I'm recommending it, even so, even though the supply might be small. Because if you want a relatively thin, fast-paced, and extremely involving story of contemporary nautical fiction, you could scarcely do better than this. So I'm going to recommend this, and I am very familiar with the nonfiction book that Mark will be talking about, so you're going to enjoy that. And then next month in February, I will be doing nonfiction, and he will move over to fiction. So there you go. That's what 2 If by Sea is going to be like for the rest of the year, as we natter on, as old salts do. But anyway, I'm going to wrap this up for now, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.